in Donald Trump's trade war with Canada over the U.S. ambassador making remarks about Canadians boycotting American travel and booze.
7 months after Canadian shoppers quietly rejected United States food products, American farmers are absorbing a trade shock that rivals a formal tariff escalation without a single law ever being passed. What began as political friction evolved into sustained consumer action inside Canadian supermarkets. Week after week, United States agricultural goods lost shelf space in one of America's most dependable export markets. This was not symbolic protest. It disrupted supply chains, pushed excess produce back into domestic markets, and drove price pressure directly onto United States farmers already operating on thin margins. 7 months later, the shift has not reversed. Alternatives have replaced United States products, habits have hardened, and losses have accumulated. The final figures and strategic consequences reveal a risk far more serious than Washington is publicly admitting. The economic strain now emerging is no longer theoretical. Export data and industry reporting indicate that reduced access to Canadian retail shelves has forced United States agricultural producers to reroute large volumes of perishable goods back into domestic markets. When produce intended for export cannot clear at full value, it is often sold at discounted prices or left unsold altogether. The result is a direct hit to farm income, not a temporary inconvenience. For American farmers, this pressure compounds existing vulnerabilities. Input costs remain elevated, transportation expenses are volatile, and profit margins are thin, even in stable years. Losing a high-volume, low-risk market like Canada amplifies every weakness in the system. What might appear as a modest decline in exports at the national level translates into severe stress at the farm level, where cash flow determines survival. The ripple effects extend beyond fields and packing houses. Trucking firms, cold storage facilities, and regional distributors that depend on cross-border agricultural trade are reporting weaker demand. In rural communities, these secondary losses quietly accumulate, tightening local labor markets and eroding economic stability. What makes this situation more dangerous is its invisibility. There is no single policy announcement to reverse, no negotiation table to return to. The next phase reveals how this hidden damage could escalate into a long-term structural loss the United States may not be able to reverse. The deeper danger now facing the United States is not the immediate revenue loss, but the structural shift taking place beneath the surface of North American trade. Once Canadian retailers began replacing United States agricultural products with alternatives from Mexico, South America, and domestic producers, supply chains did not simply pause, they adapted. Contracts were rewritten, logistics routes were adjusted, new relationships were formed. In trade, these changes are rarely temporary. For decades, Canada functioned as one of the safest agricultural export markets for the United States. Geography kept transportation costs low. Regulatory standards were familiar. Payment risk was minimal. That stability allowed American farmers to plan production with confidence. When that foundation weakens, uncertainty spreads through the entire system. Farmers do not just lose sales, they lose predictability. And predictability is what allows farms to survive volatile seasons and price swings. As Canadian buyers diversified away from United States suppliers, price pressure intensified inside the United States. Produce originally destined for export flooded domestic markets, pushing prices downward at precisely the moment when farmers needed stability. Lower prices did not mean higher consumer relief in grocery stores. Instead, they compressed farm margins while transportation and storage costs remained elevated. The burden landed where it always does in agriculture, at the production level. This shift also exposes a broader vulnerability in the current trade war environment. Tariffs are visible, they appear in headlines, policy documents, and negotiation agendas. Consumer-driven disengagement does not. It moves quietly, without a vote or a signature, yet its economic impact can rival or exceed formal trade penalties. In this case, Canada did not need to escalate through government action to impose pressure on the United States. Market behavior did the work instead. From Washington's perspective, this creates a strategic blind spot. Traditional trade responses are calibrated to counter tariffs, subsidies, and regulatory barriers. They are poorly suited to address a loss of consumer trust. Even if diplomatic relations stabilize, the United States may find that former advantages no longer translate into automatic demand. Once buyers discover that substitutes perform adequately, loyalty becomes optional. The implications extend beyond agriculture. The same consumer sentiment driving grocery choices can influence automobiles, consumer goods, and tourism. When trade disputes spill into daily life, economic integration no longer guarantees resilience. Canada has demonstrated that proximity does not equal dependency, and that message is being observed closely by other trading partners. For American farmers and rural economies, this represents a slow-moving crisis. Recovery from a bad harvest is possible. Recovery from lost market position is far more difficult. Every season spent outside preferred supply chains increases the risk that exclusion becomes permanent. The longer this boycott environment persists, the more leverage shifts away from the United States and toward alternative suppliers. What emerges next is the most unsettling element of all, evidence that this consumer-driven trade war could expand far beyond groceries, creating losses that no tariff rollback can repair. The economic consequences of Canada's consumer-driven boycott do not stop at the farm gate. Agriculture sits at the center of a much larger ecosystem, and when export demand weakens, the shock travels outward with surprising speed. For the United States, this spillover effect is now becoming visible across multiple layers of the rural economy. When agricultural exports to Canada slow, the first adjustment is not production cuts, it is inventory displacement. Produce that was scheduled for cross-border shipment is redirected into domestic channels. This creates congestion in storage facilities, increases spoilage risk, and forces distributors to clear inventory at reduced prices. Farmers absorb the initial loss, but the damage does not remain isolated. Transportation firms that specialize in cross-border agricultural trade experience immediate declines in volume. Fewer refrigerated trucks move north. Fewer contracts are renewed. Independent operators, many of whom operate on narrow margins, face reduced utilization of equipment that was financed during better years. Cold storage warehouses see shorter booking cycles. Packaging facilities reduce shifts. Each adjustment may appear minor in isolation, but together they compress economic activity across entire regions. In rural communities, these effects accumulate quietly. Employment opportunities tied directly or indirectly to agriculture begin to shrink. Seasonal labor contracts are shortened. Maintenance and service spending is delayed. Local businesses that depend on farm income feel the pressure through slower sales and rising uncertainty. This is how trade disruptions translate into social stress, even when unemployment data at the national level remains stable. What makes this particularly damaging is timing. United States farmers are already contending with elevated input costs, volatile fuel prices, and tightening credit conditions. Export losses to Canada arrive not as a singular shock, but as an additional burden layered onto an already strained system. In this environment, even modest revenue declines can determine whether an operation remains solvent. For policymakers in Washington, these developments pose a difficult challenge. Agricultural support programs are designed to respond to weather disasters or price collapses, not to gradual market erosion caused by foreign consumer behavior. There is no emergency declaration to trigger, no clear policy lever to pull, yet the economic consequences continue to deepen. Beyond rural America, the boycott raises broader questions about the resilience of the United States economy in a prolonged trade war environment. Canada has long been viewed as an extension of the domestic market, a partner so integrated that demand was assumed to be stable regardless of political friction. That assumption is now under strain. When a close trading partner demonstrates the ability to reorient consumption away from United States products, it sends a signal to other markets. Dependence on American supply is no longer seen as inevitable. Alternatives exist, and switching costs may be lower than previously believed. This perception weakens the informal leverage that the United States has relied upon for decades. From a macroeconomic perspective, this matters because agriculture plays a stabilizing role during periods of industrial volatility. When manufacturing contracts or interest rates rise, exports of food and agricultural products often provide a buffer. If that buffer weakens, economic shocks become harder to absorb. The loss of a dependable market like Canada increases exposure to global price swings and competitive pressure. There is also a political dimension. Farmers represent a concentrated and influential constituency. As losses mount, pressure on federal authorities intensifies. Calls for relief, renegotiation, or retaliation grow louder. Yet, responding with additional tariffs risks escalating the trade war further, potentially provoking additional consumer backlash abroad. This creates a strategic trap. Aggressive trade measures may satisfy short-term political demands, but they risk accelerating the very behavior that caused the problem. Restraint, on the other hand, offers no immediate relief to those already suffering losses. Washington is caught between two unsatisfying options, neither of which guarantees recovery of lost ground. Perhaps most concerning is the durability of consumer behavior. Once Canadian households adjust purchasing habits and retailers normalize new supply chains, reversal becomes unlikely without a compelling incentive. Price alone may not be sufficient. Trust, once damaged, is slow to rebuild. In trade, time favors the new equilibrium, not the old one. And this leads to a far more disturbing question that emerges next. What happens if this consumer-driven disengagement expands beyond agriculture, transforming a localized boycott into a systemic threat to the United States' economic position in North America? As the boycott environment persists, the challenge for the United States is no longer confined to agriculture. It has become a test of strategic credibility in a prolonged trade war setting. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that economic integration with Canada created a form of insulation. Disputes might arise, tariffs might be threatened, but the underlying trade relationship would endure. That assumption is now being tested in real time. What distinguishes this moment is that Canada has not relied primarily on formal tariffs to exert pressure. While tariff measures exist in the background, the most consequential shift has occurred through market behavior. Consumers, retailers, and distributors have adjusted independently, creating outcomes that policy instruments were never designed to manage. From Washington's perspective, this is deeply uncomfortable. Trade negotiations can address tariffs. They cannot compel demand. This dynamic weakens traditional leverage. In a classic trade war scenario, retaliation is predictable and measurable. Governments respond to tariffs with tariffs. Industries lobby. Talks resume. In a consumer-driven disengagement, there is no central authority to negotiate with. Even if political relations improve, the United States may find that demand does not immediately return. The strategic cost becomes clear when viewed comparatively. Other exporters now see evidence that proximity to the United States does not guarantee permanence. Markets once considered secure can be contested. For competitors, this lowers perceived barriers to entry. For the United States, it raises the cost of maintaining market share across sectors. Inside Washington, this creates a policy dilemma. Escalation through additional tariffs risks reinforcing negative perceptions and accelerating consumer disengagement abroad. De-escalation, meanwhile, offers no assurance that lost demand will recover. The United States faces the possibility of absorbing losses without a clear mechanism for reversal, an outcome rarely acknowledged in trade planning. The most dangerous aspect of the Canadian boycott is not what has already occurred, but what it demonstrates is possible. Agriculture is uniquely vulnerable because of perishability and thin margins, but the logic of consumer-driven disengagement does not stop there. Once political sentiment becomes embedded in purchasing decisions, it can migrate across categories. Early signals suggest that some Canadian consumers are extending scrutiny beyond food. United States branded consumer goods face closer inspection. Travel decisions are reconsidered. Large purchases, such as vehicles or appliances, are increasingly framed as expressions of national preference rather than purely economic choices. None of these shifts need to be universal to matter. Even partial adoption can reshape demand at scale. For the United States economy, this introduces a form of risk that is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Unlike tariffs, which can be lifted with a signature, consumer behavior hardens over time. Each month that passes reinforces new habits. Each season strengthens alternative supply chains. The longer disengagement persists, the less relevant former advantages become. This also complicates domestic economic planning. Industries exposed to export markets rely on predictability to justify investment. When demand from a close partner like Canada becomes uncertain, capital spending slows. Expansion plans are delayed. Employment growth weakens. These secondary effects may not appear immediately in national statistics, but they accumulate steadily. For American farmers, the implications are especially stark. Agriculture does not pivot quickly, crops are planted months in advance, infrastructure investments span decades. When access to a premium export market erodes, adaptation is slow and costly. By the time conditions improve, competitors may already be entrenched. What emerges is a new reality for the United States in the trade war era. Economic power is no longer exercised solely through policy instruments. It is mediated through perception, trust, and consumer choice. Losing ground in those areas imposes costs that tariffs alone cannot offset. And this brings us to the most consequential twist of all, evidence that the United States may be facing a structural shift in North American trade that no short-term policy adjustment can undo. At this stage, the challenge confronting the United States is no longer tactical. It is structural. The tools Washington has historically relied upon to manage trade disputes were designed for a different era, one in which governments controlled the primary levers of economic pressure. Tariffs, quotas, negotiated exemptions, and retaliatory lists were effective precisely because demand remained largely insulated from political sentiment. That condition no longer holds. In the current trade war environment, consumer perception has become an independent force. Canadian households did not wait for policy direction to change behavior. Retailers did not require government mandates to restructure supply chains. Once these shifts occurred, they began operating on commercial logic rather than political alignment. Cost stability, risk reduction, and reputational signaling now outweigh legacy trade relationships. For Washington, this reality limits the effectiveness of short-term remedies. Rolling back tariffs or issuing conciliatory statements may reduce official tension, but they do not automatically restore lost demand. In many cases, the incentives now favor maintaining diversified sourcing rather than reverting to previous dependence on United States suppliers. From a business perspective, resilience has become more valuable than familiarity. This also complicates domestic policy responses. Subsidies can offset losses temporarily, but they do not rebuild market position. Trade agreements can reopen doors, but they cannot force consumers to walk through them. As a result, the United States risks entering a cycle in which public funds are used to stabilize industries while underlying competitive advantages quietly erode. The long-term consequence is a subtle but meaningful reduction in economic influence. When the United States loses its position as the default supplier, it must compete harder, offer deeper concessions, or accept lower margins. Over time, this shifts bargaining power away from Washington and toward buyers who now recognize their ability to impose costs without formal retaliation. The most unsettling realization is that this boycott may not represent an isolated reaction, but a template. Canada's experience demonstrates that a close trading partner can apply economic pressure without triggering the political and legal thresholds associated with traditional trade conflict. There are no emergency summits, no formal disputes to adjudicate, no clear moment of escalation or resolution. For the United States, this introduces a new vulnerability. Economic leadership has long depended not only on scale and productivity, but on trust and predictability. When political language undermines those foundations, the economic consequences do not arrive as a single shock. They unfold gradually, embedding themselves into market behavior in ways that are difficult to reverse. If this pattern is replicated elsewhere, the implications extend far beyond North America. Other partners may conclude that disengagement carries fewer risks than confrontation. Consumer sentiment, once activated, becomes a low-cost instrument of influence. In that environment, the United States faces a paradox. The more integrated its economy is with others, the more exposed it becomes to sentiment-driven pullback. This is where the trade war narrative changes fundamentally. The central risk is no longer retaliation, it is normalization. Once reduced demand becomes routine, it fades from headlines while continuing to drain value. Losses accumulate quietly, market share shifts permanently, and policy responses arrive too late to matter. The final question, then, is not whether the United States can end this dispute, but whether it can adapt to a world where economic power is exercised without warning, without tariffs, and without a clear path back. What that means for American workers and consumers is revealed in the conclusion. 7 months into Canada's consumer-driven boycott, the economic signal is now impossible to ignore. What initially appeared to be a symbolic reaction has evolved into a sustained disruption of one of the United States' most reliable export relationships. For American farmers, the impact has been direct and painful. Reduced access to Canadian markets has translated into lower prices, tighter margins, and growing uncertainty in rural communities already under financial strain. For Washington, the lesson is broader and more uncomfortable. In the modern trade war environment, tariffs are no longer the only instrument capable of reshaping outcomes. Consumer behavior, once mobilized, can impose costs that formal policy struggles to counter. When trust erodes, demand does not automatically return, even if diplomatic tensions ease. Canada's response has demonstrated that economic pressure can be applied quietly, without escalation, and without the political risks associated with official retaliation. That reality forces a reassessment of how trade power is exercised and defended. The United States now faces a choice between adapting to this new landscape or continuing to rely on tools designed for a different era. The central question remains unresolved and demands serious debate. Is this a bold strategy or a risky mistake for the United States?